Sera Calloway had never wanted to be a bride. She had wanted, more than anything, to finish reorganizing the supply shelves in the pack infirmary before the morning rounds began. She had wanted to see the 3 youngest fever patients eat a full breakfast. She had wanted, on the morning her father called her into his study and closed the door behind her, to simply be left alone to do the quiet, necessary work she had always done. Instead, she stood in front of a man who looked like he had forgotten how to sleep and listened to him explain that she was going to marry the Alpha King of Dawnridge. Her father did not ask, he explained. There was a difference, and Sera had grown up understanding it. She walked through the infirmary that night after everyone had gone to sleep. She counted the beds. She stopped at 31. 31 people who were alive because the fighting had paused long enough for medicine to reach them. 31 people who would not survive another season of war. She went back to her father's study and told him yes. She did not tell him it was for 31 people. She did not think he would understand, and she was not interested in being understood that night. She was interested in the outcome. The wedding was held on a stone bridge over the river that had served, for 3 years, as the place where both sides exchanged their dead. It rained. No one cheered. The sky was the color of old iron, and the water below moved fast and cold and didn't care about any of it. Caden Voss stood across from her, and she saw immediately what the rumors had built and what the rumors had missed. He was tall and broad, and looked like a man who had won every fight he had ever been in, which was true. But what the rumors had not mentioned was the look behind his eyes. Not cruelty, not arrogance, but something older and more tired. The look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long he no longer remembered what it felt like to put it down. He looked at her the way people look at a solution they don't entirely trust. Measuring, calculating, waiting for her to perform something. Fear, charm, resentment, political warmth. She did none of those things. She met his eyes, and stood still, and waited for the words to be said, so that the thing could be done. His hand, when he took hers for the bonding words, was cold. Hers was steady. She noticed that he noticed. Dawnridge was larger than she had expected, and quieter than it had any right to be. The stronghold sat against a dark hillside, stone and timber, built for function rather than beauty. The people who passed her in the corridors on her first day looked at her the way you look at weather coming in from the wrong direction, not hostile exactly, just uncertain. Caden placed her in the east wing. He assigned her a guard she didn't need, and gave her no instructions about how to fill her days. She understood what that meant. She was a symbol. Symbols were meant to be visible and still. Sera had never been good at being still. By the end of her first week, she had introduced herself to the pack's 2 healers, learned both of their names and the names of their families, and identified a shortage in wound-sealing supplies that the infirmary had been quietly managing for 2 months by rationing. No one had reported it because reporting it meant explaining why it had gone unaddressed for so long, and people in positions of small power rarely enjoy explaining their failures upward. Sera wrote a supply requisition. She formatted it the way her pack's medical records were formatted, clearly, specifically, with the medical reasoning attached, so that whoever approved it would understand not just what she was asking for, but why it mattered. She sent it through the correct administrative channel. It landed on Caden's desk 3 days later. His head of resources came to him personally to ask if a new physician had joined the staff. Caden read the name on the order twice. He approved it without comment. He did not say anything to Sera about it, but he kept the requisition on his desk for 2 days before filing it, and he was not entirely sure why. The first real conversation happened by accident, the way real things often do. He walked the east courtyard before dawn, because he had done it every morning for 3 years, ever since the war made sleeping past darkness feel dangerous. It was habit now. He no longer needed the vigilance, but he kept it, because it was the only quiet time he had. He did not expect to find her already there. She was sitting on the stone wall at the far end of the courtyard, her knees pulled up slightly, looking north. Looking, he realized as he stopped walking, toward the mountain line that separated Dawnridge from Ashenvale. He should have turned around. Instead, he walked across the courtyard and said, more bluntly than he intended, that it was early. She said she was an early person. He asked what she was looking at. She said she was checking whether the mountains looked different from this side. He stood next to her and looked north. The mountains were exactly the same mountains, the same dark ridgeline against the same pale sky. He asked if they did. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said they looked the same. The mountains didn't know there was a war. They had just kept being mountains through the whole thing. He didn't respond. He wasn't sure there was a response to that, exactly. It wasn't a political statement or a complaint or an attempt to say something meaningful. It was just an observation, offered plainly, about the way things look from different sides. He stood there for another few minutes before going inside. The observation stayed with him for the rest of the day, which annoyed him. He was not a man who held on to things. Dax, Caden's third, and the man who had fought closest to him through all 3 years of the war, made his feelings about Sera clear without ever saying them directly. He was experienced enough to know that direct words left evidence. Instead, it was the small things, the way her place at the table was set last, after everyone else, so that she arrived to a seat already surrounded, the way conversations finished just as she walked into a room, leaving her with silence and no entry point, the way assignments were made and decisions were announced without anyone thinking to ask the Luna what she thought, even when the assignments and decisions were exactly the kind she knew something about. Sera did not report any of this to Caden. She had learned, growing up in a pack that did not entirely value her, that reporting small hostilities rarely improved them. It only created a new problem on top of the old one. Now there was the hostility, and also the resentment of having been reported. She preferred to work around obstacles rather than announce them. She built trust slowly and without ceremony. She learned the healer's rhythms and worked within them rather than above them. She sat with the families in the lower settlement when she could, not as the Alpha King's wife performing goodwill, but as a person who was genuinely interested in whether the children were eating and whether the older members of the pack had what they needed for winter. She remembered names. She asked follow-up questions. She showed up the second time, which was the thing that mattered most, because anyone could show up once. Caden noticed. He was a man who had built his entire survival on noticing things that other people missed. He watched Dax. He watched Sera not react. And he began, slowly, to understand something he had never had the opportunity to understand before, that there were two kinds of strength, the kind that pushed outward, that dominated and controlled and won, and the kind that held, that endured, that absorbed pressure without breaking. He had spent his entire life building himself into the first kind. It had served him well, but standing in the doorway of the settlement longhouse on the second day of the fever outbreak, watching Sera sit down in the dirt and hold a frightened 4-year-old's hand and tell her quietly that she was not going anywhere, he understood for the first time that the second kind was not a lesser version of strength. It was its own thing entirely, and he had never possessed it. The fever came fast and hit the children hardest. Within 36 hours, the settlement's healer was overwhelmed. Within 48 hours, Sera had organized the response so efficiently that 2 of Caden's senior staff members assumed she had done this before, in a professional capacity, and asked her where she had trained. She said she hadn't trained anywhere formal, she had just paid attention. Caden arrived at the settlement on the second morning and stood in the doorway of the main care room for a long time without anyone noticing him. Sera was moving between beds, giving instructions to 3 healers at once, her voice calm and specific, in a room that had every reason to be panicked. She was tracking 6 children simultaneously, adjusting treatments, managing supplies, and she was doing it without raising her voice, or her hands, or her level of visible stress. A small girl, no older than 4, was crying for her mother. Her mother was in the next room with a fever of her own. Sera, in the middle of everything, stopped. She sat down on the floor next to the child's cot, in the dirt, in the middle of the organized chaos of the room, and took the child's hand and said clearly that she was not going anywhere until her mother came. The child stopped crying. Caden walked home. He sat in his war room for a long time, looking at the maps on the wall, and did not think about war at all. He began including her in resource meetings, not ceremonially, not as a gesture of political unity, but because her assessments were accurate and her priorities aligned with the pack's survival rather than with anyone's personal interests. She didn't speak in meetings to be heard. She spoke when she had something to contribute, and when she spoke, the thing she said was usually the thing that needed to be said and hadn't been. His people began to notice. She was spoken of, in the way people speak of useful things, as someone who could be trusted to give you a real answer. Not the Alpha King's wife. Not Ashenvale's daughter. Just Sera, who knew what she was talking about, and showed up when she said she would. Dax noticed too. He did not adjust. The accusation, when it came, was thin. A supply route Sera had approved ran through a distribution point that had historical connections to an Ashenvale contact. Dax brought it to the council with careful language and a concerned expression, implying without stating that perhaps the Luna's loyalties were not as settled as they appeared. The room was quiet. The accusation didn't have to be proven to do its damage. It only had to exist. Caden was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he would investigate. He investigated personally, transparently, over 3 days. He found nothing. He said so in front of the full council, clearly, and without softening the conclusion. Then he removed Dax from the council and explained that he would not tolerate a member of his inner circle using suspicion as a political tool, because suspicion without evidence was not protection, it was poison. Dax left. 2 council members followed. Caden let them go without a word. He came to her quarters that night for the first time since she had arrived. He stood in the doorway and told her what had happened, clearly and plainly, the way he would brief a trusted officer. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked what it had cost him. He thought about it honestly and said less than he had expected. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That was how you knew it was the right call. The right calls always cost less than you feared, because you stopped carrying the weight of almost doing them." He looked at her in the way he had been careful not to look at her for 3 months. He said, "When did you get so sure of things?" She said she had never been sure of anything. She had just stopped waiting until she was. What followed was not a sudden event. There was no single night where something changed. It was more like a gradual return of feeling, in a part of yourself, that you had kept carefully numb for a long time, not because you wanted to, but because it was the only way to keep moving. They shared the early courtyard mornings without discussing it. He started telling her about the war, not the strategy, not the victories, but the parts that had stayed with him, the things he had seen that he hadn't told anyone, because there was no one to tell. She listened without flinching and without trying to resolve it, which was exactly the right thing to do, and also the rarest thing. She told him about Ashenvale, the real version, not the political one, the smell of the pine forests in winter, the way her mother had marked the solstice, the particular quality of morning light on the mountain stone that she had grown up thinking was ordinary and only understood was beautiful after she had left it. He learned that he had spent his entire life confusing peace with silence. He had thought that peace was what happened when the noise stopped. But sitting next to Sera in the early morning, with the mountains still dark to the north and the courtyard quiet around them, he understood that peace was not an absence of anything. It was a presence. It was something you were near. She was not a quiet person. She was a clear one. They were walking the settlement boundary at dusk on a cold, clear evening, when she caught her foot on a loose stone and stumbled. He caught her arm before she fell, and neither of them stepped back to the distance they had maintained for months. She looked up at him. He did not move. He said he needed to tell her something. She said he should. He said, "I think you are the only thing in this stronghold that doesn't feel like war." It was the most honest sentence he had spoken in years. He knew it when it left him. The kind of sentence that cannot be taken back, and that you don't want to take back, even though it leaves you standing completely open, which is the most uncomfortable place a person can stand. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she took his hand, not dramatically, not as an answer to a question, just the simple, deliberate decision of a woman who had made peace with her choices and moved forward into them. His hand was still cold. Hers was still steady. The season turned. Dawnridge stabilized. The border stayed quiet. The blood bond that had been built as a political structure became something neither of them had been asked to build, and both of them had built anyway, in the small decisions and honest conversations and early mornings of a life that had started as an arrangement and became, without announcement, a home. Caden ruled differently, not softer, not weaker, but less alone, which made him more accurate, because loneliness, he had learned, was its own distortion. It made you see everything as a threat, because there was no one standing next to you, reminding you what things actually were. On the first anniversary of the ceasefire, he took her back to the stone bridge over the river. The rain was gone, the morning was cold and clear, and the water below still moved fast and didn't care about any of it. She asked him if it felt different now. He stood there and thought about it the way she had taught him to think, genuinely, without rushing toward the answer that sounded right. Then he said the war had ended the day he married her, but he thought he had ended the day he let her stay. She looked at the water for a moment, then she looked at him. She did not say anything, because some things do not need saying. Some things have already been said in every early morning, and every honest conversation, and every moment of staying when leaving would have been easier. She took his hand. His hand was still cold. Hers was still steady. He noticed. He was always going to notice,